The race is on, and who has really been F1 star rookie in 2025? That's the question we'll be answering as we look over the first half of the season for Kimi Antonelli, Isack Hadjar, Ollie Bearman, Gabriel Bortoleto, Jack Doohan, remember him, and Franco Colapinto. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to rank the newcomers are Ben Anderson and Scott Mitchell-Malm. Well, I feel like we've been here before, Scott, because we did a rookies podcast pre-season because it was an interesting rookie crop, and that's why we're coming back to it. But I feel like we've got to get into the why is Liam Lawson not there debate straight away. So why is Liam Lawson not included in our list?
Well, as we sort of established at the very start of the year, because we had discussed this quite a lot over the winter, we felt that two-part seasons just excluded him, even though that first part season was very bit part. It wasn't like he came in mid and then stayed to the end like he did in 2024. So I think Lawson, it's I feel like he does not care at all. But I feel like if he was aggrieved to be left out, you could sort of have a bit of sympathy for him. But he didn't fit the bill. It wasn't Ollie Bearman doing 3 races. But I guess you want to use this to segue into why we're including someone else who's done a part season.
Well, that's exactly it. Yeah, Franco Colapinto, even though he did a fair few races last year, he did 9, didn't he? The fact that was just one little batch meant he just sort of slipped in. What do you think of that, Ben? I think we started up with some controversy on this podcast immediately.
Yeah. I'm questioning the maths. So does Colapinto count even though he's done more races in his mini stint put together than Lawson did in his mini stints put together?
I don't think he has he? I'm pretty sure
Lawson had done a few more, yeah.
Yeah, Lawson's done more. But what I think
not
the best
vastly
way...
more, though.
But I think the best way to explain why Colapinto gets it is basically the chunk of this season that he missed by the time he came in basically offset the in-season run he had last year. And he's started, I think, fewer Grand Prix than Ollie Bearman has overall. So when you look at it like that, it's, well, we're not going to exclude Bearman because he did 3 races last year, are we? So
we'd have
that's the criteria anyway. Look, it's our podcast. We're going to do whatever we want. If anyone's got a problem with it, they can just shut up and get on with it.
I think Lawson was asked about this pre-season, wasn't he? And he felt that he was still a rookie, especially as he was going to some tracks for like the first time in like many, 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 many years, and the first time in Formula 1, definitely. So he'll certainly consider it controversial.
Yeah, I remember we did a little round table with him at F1 75. And he said that when he goes to, say, a race like Australia, he is a rookie because he's not done it before. But, yeah, a little bit harsh. I mean, there's no official definition for what a rookie is in Formula 1. I know there are some categories where they have formal rookie honours and that kind of thing. There is a technical definition. But this is the one we've gone with, and we're sticking with it. And if you don't like it, well, you can make your own podcast about
Liam Lawson. No, in all seriousness, I think the best way to summarise it for Lawson in particular is, as we sit here and record this, it's the midway point of the 25 season. So we've had 12 races so far, and Liam Lawson, I believe, has started 23 Grand Prix. He's done a full season.
That's a season
at the point where we're recording this. So, like, it's, any justification we do for this is going to be completely arbitrary. We've made up our rules. These are the rules. I'm sorry, deal with it. And in all seriousness, if you do have a problem with it and you have a great case to make for why we should have included Lawson, or we maybe shouldn't have included Colapinto and Bearman because Bearman's done 3 races before the start of the year, just write to us and let us know, and maybe we'll
ignore you.
Well, as before we started recording this, Ed thought we'd already recorded the Rookies podcast, so we'll just have to record the Rookies podcast again as a revised one with the ones omitted that the excellent case for omission means we have to leave them out.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Well, it is somewhat arbitrary, but it allows us to discuss an interesting crop of drivers, and I'm sure we'll get into Lawson in a bit more depth at some point in the future because he's an interesting driver as well. But what we're going to do is we're going to go through what we've designated to be the 6 rookies. So we're going to start off, Ben, with Kimi Antonelli. In points terms, he's the leading rookie, isn't he? 63 points. Has he lived up to the sky-high expectations after he was thrown at the deep end by Mercedes?
Well, I think flat out no. Really, because as you mentioned in the question, those expectations were sky high, and they weren't expectations put upon him by us, media types and whatnot. It's by his own team. Toto Wolff has declared him the new Verstappen. You're replacing Lewis Hamilton, which is obviously a massively tough act to follow. And I don't know, he's just a bit. I'm not saying he's a bad driver at all. He's very, very, very good, but it doesn't so far seem to have had that wow factor. I don't feel like I'm watching the best rookie since Lewis Hamilton, for example. So I think he's done fine. And it probably says more for the kind of teammate he's up against, the benchmark in George Russell just being so so good. It makes it much harder for a driver like Antonelli to stand out. The car's obviously not been amazing either. But yeah, I'm still kind of waiting after Melbourne, when he had that sort of stealth run to the points from the back in the terrible conditions, and other rookie drivers had a bit of a mare. I thought, oh, that's it, he's arrived. That'll settle him down, and it'll just be kick on from here. And it's kind of it's been a bit stuttering. There's been runs of okay form. There's been a couple of good peaks, which is a good yardstick with which to judge a rookie, because it is hard to string it together. But I don't know. I feel like I'm still waiting for the real Antonelli to show up.
The thing that surprised me, because I agree about the peaks are usually what you look out for, but I actually feel like it's almost happened the other way around. I was expecting Antonelli to have quite a few peaks, but then a few of the anonymous rookie weekends, the difficult rookie weekends, the mistakes here and there, like dotted in throughout it, that would prevent it stringing it together. But you've got the Miami qualifying, obviously very, very strong, and the way he pulled it back in Canada qualifying, and then the race in Canada was also very good. Obviously got his first F1 podium, which was very good. If you take it at that level, I think that's the Antonelli that we expected. What has surprised me is that he actually built a really good foundation for his rookie season in the first sort of 5 events or so. If you looked at the way up to Miami, basically, if you looked at the way he was chipping away at it, the deficits to Russell, particularly over once I think he'd got over, initially seemed to have got over the hurdle in the Japan weekend, where he realised he'd left too much on the table in Friday practice and had too much work to do. Then the race was pretty good there. The Bahrain and Saudi weekends seemed to be sort of more like what we needed. And then bam, right there in Miami, new track, didn't matter. He was right there from the start, really strong on the front foot. But then
even Russell was impressed, wasn't he, that weekend?
Exactly.
I remember.
And he hasn't kicked on from there. He's had regressions. No. He's sort of picked it back up again. And by his own admission, nothing seems to really be working at the moment. So it is, look, it's slightly strange that he did that really, really good foundational work early on, but he's still kind of waiting really for it to pay dividends.
It's strange, isn't it? It's certainly been decent rather than great as a rookie season. That third place in Canada is his only points finish in the last 6 events. And that's the thing. The thing is that concerns me, Ben, when evaluating Antonelli, is obviously we're conscious of this sky-high expectation, which, as you quite rightly say, that's come from pretty much Mercedes doing that. And then after you had the crash at Monza last year, there was kind of that calm, conservative approach. I was quite interested by Antonelli talking a few races ago about the fact that he had been kind of deliberately conservative and he needs to kick on. And that's always the thing that worries me. It's quite easy to kind of put yourself in the conservative mindset, and it can be quite hard to force your way out of it, in a way, because you almost lock in on it. That would concern me a little bit with Antonelli, because I do want to see a few more peaks from him in what's been a certainly not a bad season, but not had those peaks. Well, certainly not had the frequency of peaks we anticipated.
No, it's a confusing one, and I think the language that Toto Wolff used after Silverstone, when he was referencing in general how the team had tackled the British Grand Prix badly. I don't think that's a spoiler now. And he said that they were overthinking. And I think that probably applies to Antonelli too. And I think the response was in relation to a question about Antonelli specifically, and Toto kind of went off into a generalisation about the team. But it does feel like Antonelli doesn't really quite know where to pitch himself. It's like he made a bad impact in that FP1 and has talked several times about how that's affected him, and he's had to dial it back. And then he's trying to dial it up again, but he just can't seem to quite settle at the right level. And then you've got the expectation, and that must weigh. Normally, you'd expect a team to be kind of playing a driver down in that scenario, but if anything, they've hyped him up probably too much. Then you've got the car being inconsistent. I mean, at least he achieved when the car was at its best. You know, Russell won in Canada, Antonelli backed him up by being on the podium. The rest of the time, perhaps it's just Russell's greater experience really paying him back. I know they've messed around with the rear suspension too. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but when they kind of had to row back on that from Imola onwards, that's coincided with Antonelli not having a great time of things. The thing that concerns me is the raw pace. I know Russell was a high benchmark, but he's been dropped by him in qualifying. Apart from the Miami anomaly, it's 11-1, isn't it, in Grand Prix qualifying? An average gap of about 3.5 tenths, which I think is quite big. especially if you're talking this driver up as the next Verstappen, you expect to see, especially with rookies, raw pace. That's what you're really looking at. I feel like with the races, the whole challenge of time management and how difficult that is for everybody, you allow a little bit more. And I think we've seen even that manifest, the more difficult time management races like Bahrain, much more difficult races where it's a bit more obvious and the strategy's not so complicated. It's been a bit better, but I'm just not seeing the raw pace. But if you look at the points averages and try to compare Antonelli to other kind of star rookies, if you like, if we put Russell in that kind of top tier of drivers with the likes of Leclerc and Verstappen and Norris, etc. I mean, Norris had, I think it was some sums, 45% of Sainz's points by the halfway point of their first season together at McLaren in 2019. That's 46%, sorry. And Piastri had 45% of Norris's points in their first season as teammates in 23 when Piastri was a rookie. And Antonelli at the moment's on 43% of Russell's points. So it's low, but it's not miles off.
What percentage of Cubis's points did Russell have as a rookie?
Exactly.
That's an irresolvable equation, that one.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, he should have had more. Overall, the problem Antonelli's got is just being plunged in at the deep end, like you said at the start, Ed. You go straight into. I know Mercedes are not quite what they were, but it's still a top team, one of the biggest, and that is not an easy place to make all your mistakes and learn your lessons, isn't it? I know that they felt they made a mistake by having Russell in at Williams for too long, and by the time he got into the Mercedes, he was more than ready. But I do still wonder if maybe for Antonelli, it's just a little bit too much too soon.
To circle back to something you said at the early in that answer, Ben, about overthinking, I do find it interesting that, to me anyway, Antonelli's been most impressive at the tracks he doesn't know, or that he has minimal experience at. Japan, Canada, Miami, all stand out. And I was really expecting once F1 came back to Europe, I thought that it's perfect now. It's set up so well for him to really kick on because he's done that hard work. He learned so much in those first few weekends, and he did a really good job of sort of channeling sort of some of those lessons in quite quickly. Like, for example, learning on the fly during that Japan weekend, kind of realizing I've got too much work to do here. I'm just going to go out and try and make that big step in one go. And then it just hasn't happened. And there have been some specific circumstances about that. Obviously, it was a very clumsy first lap accident in Austria. He wasn't... you can't hold what happened, anything that happened basically in the Silverstone race against him. Obviously, Mercedes openly admits that it botched pretty much every call it had to make during the course of that Grand Prix. And he got speared by another rookie that we're going to get into later in this podcast in the race, which wrecked his chances there. But I was just curious when I was looking back at like where those peaks had come from, and just thinking, as he's tried to get more out of the car, as he's looked for sort of little areas where he can maybe get to that peak a little bit more, as he's trying to exploit things maybe he knows on about certain circuits, what worked in F2 or what's worked in the private testing he's done, is he coming up against something that's slightly catching him out with this car, with these tyres, whatever, versus when he went into Japan or Miami or Canada, the expectations are lower. He's learning he's even more, he's a very, very young guy and a rookie. He's a pretty clean slate, but he still has habits. But when he goes to tracks that he really doesn't know, or his experience is at the absolute minimum versus others, maybe there's a little bit more kind of dynamic or active learning going on that just means he kind of gels with the car a bit more nicely there versus other tracks where maybe he's trying to get it to do something that it just doesn't want to do, or he can't work out. It's really interesting. It's definitely something I'd like to sort of quiz him and Mercedes on over the next couple of races before the summer break and see if there's anything in that.
He's unusual, I think, in Antonelli because he was thrown into Mercedes quite early and he's going to be there next year. I think we all expect it, so I guess there's a small chance he won't be, but it means we can only really judge how he's doing in his rookie campaign almost in retrospect, because it's all about the trajectory, isn't it? And to a great or lesser extent, that's true of all of these drivers. What happens in the second half of the year is going to be essential in terms of that trajectory. But I think Antonelli's got kind of we need to take a wider perspective. So we're not saying that he's been a disaster or a failure or anything. He's just sort of in the balance, hasn't it? It's definitely been a decent rookie season, but it's not been a Verstappen rookie season or a Hamilton or a Piastri or a Norris, even though, as you say, those points percentages are an interesting figure. But Norris certainly deserved, if he'd had a bit more luck on his side, would have had a greater slice of the science points. But we'll be keeping a close eye on Antonelli. Should we move on to Antonelli's 2024 F2 teammate now? Scott, Haas driver, Ollie Bearman. Fast but erratic would be my summary. What do you make of him?
Yeah, I think that is a good summary. He's definitely had higher peaks than Antonelli. He's had moments where he's been exceptionally quick. He's also driven some really mature, high-quality races as well. But he has also had some, very, like, even for rookie errors, very, very basic ones, to get grid penalties in 2 of the last, 4 races? Is it Monaco and Britain for offences in practice that, he can count himself a little bit unlucky for, but at the same time, don't do what he did in FP3 at Silverstone. That was, there was no excuse for that. That's not like, you maybe slightly unlucky in Monaco, but there's not really an argument for what happened at Silverstone. There's been the odd misstep elsewhere as well. For example, Melbourne, the FP2 crash in the season opener was somewhat forgivable. It was, it feels like every other year someone has that crash there. I mean, my numbers might be well off there, but it's a very familiar crash, isn't it? The one sort of through the high-speed S's. But it was the one in FP3, out straight away, silly misjudgment, gets a bit on the grass, crashes again. Not what he or the team needed. I feel like he has almost been his own worst enemy at times this season, and it's meant that he has actually underachieved slightly versus what was possible. What saves him versus Antonelli, for example, is like when he's at his best, he's quite clearly quicker than Esteban Ocon. I think he's got a tenth and a bit on Ocon when they're both on their best days. But Bearman's opened the door in the last few races for Ocon to actually get a bit of a hold on him. And Ocon's, after a bit of a dip, he was very Esteban Ocon in the first 6 races. I think he had a couple of really good drives, a couple of so-so drives, and a couple of absolutely anonymous, my car's broken, everything's against me kind of weekends. Since then, I think he's had a little bit of a sort of, sharpen up warning from Io Komatsu. And then since then, I think he's been a really difficult yardstick for Bearman, because even though the pace isn't quite on Bearman's level, the race drives have been really strong. And I think that has highlighted what Bearman's missing with his inexperience, and that kind of, by his own admission, Bearman's approach is to just go out and rag it. Like, that has been his approach for as long as he's been driving. And he has been working to balance that out a little bit in his first full season, but there's still work to do there, because I just don't think he's doing the best job he can do, not just even in races, but just generally, and like, he's compromising too many of his weekends.
I do think Antonelli would benefit from that kind of more wild approach, though. Maybe it's easier for Bearman to do because of the team he's in, and Antonelli feels the pressure too much. But that kind of just trust yourself and go and try to extract the absolute maximum, regardless of what might happen. I think that's, even though he's made some misjudgments, I think we're seeing some things that give me more faith in Bearman at this point than Antonelli, in that he bounces back from these mistakes, however silly they are, and it doesn't seem to affect him in the next session or the next race. And that pure pace is there. Like, as you mentioned, Scott, he's got that edge on Ocon. I think that surprised Ocon and also sent Ocon a little bit loopy in the first part of the season. Like, he kind of lost his head a bit, thinking, oh God, this guy's really quick. And although he's scored more points, Ocon, and there's been a few, like you say, a few races where Bearman's been his own worst enemy, and that's allowed Ocon to kind of stamp some authority, I still feel like Ocon's kind of hanging on based on Nous and his experience, the time management in the middle of the Austria race. That's the thing where Ocon used his greater experience, and Bearman was a little bit exposed, like any rookie maybe would be, in terms of it being difficult. Now, Silverstone, Bearman is the quickest guy in the whole midfield, basically, through the sessions and into qualifying, but the silly penalty holds him back. And when I'm judging him, I'm thinking, but that pace is always there. Like, at every point, he's had Hülkenberg as a yardstick, been really impressive. He's now had Ocon as a yardstick, been immediately more impressive. I feel like he should take the confidence from that. The only question mark then, of course, when you compare to someone like Antonelli, is, well, Antonelli's going up against Russell in a much bigger team. So is it really a fair comparison when we know that as good as Esteban Ocon is, he's not on the radar of those kind of teams.
But despite that, he's outscoring Bearman 23-6 so far. So that's what I mean. Like, I get the point, but I think it's a little bit like it's a bit generous to Bearman or a bit unfair on Ocon. Like, it's not just surviving on that nous and that ability during those tricky parts. The Austria middle stint's a great example because it's where Bearman's race completely fell apart, and he admitted that afterwards. But that kind of thing is like, oh, okay, that's why, if there's one or two chances to score big, Ocon's the one that scored big. It doesn't explain a 23-6 points deficit. That is, I think Ocon's absolutely at the upper end of what the Haas could have achieved this year points-wise, but Bearman's right at the bottom end of it. He should have more than 6 points, and I think he is more responsible for that than any other circumstances sort of going against him.
It makes for a fascinating comparison with Antonelli, doesn't it? Because we've got one driver that we will complain about Antonelli for, he hasn't shown those edges of pace. And then we move on to Bearman, who I would say, we're going to rank the rookies at the end of this. If you were to rank it on who is the fastest rookie, which is not because it's a more global thing, I personally would go for Bearman. But I am not going to be arguing for him being top rookie at the end of this podcast, a bit of a spoiler there, because I don't think he's been the best rookie. So, but that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it shows you expect this with rookies, don't you? They'll tick some boxes, not tick the others. But I must admit, by inclination, I would rather have one who's really fast like Bearman and you saying, come on, string it together, stop making these silly errors, rather than Antonelli, who's like, well, yeah, you've been sensible in your approach, but we'd actually just like to see a little bit more off the leash. So I guess that's the key thing here, and what you favour depends on your outlet, doesn't it? You can make a case for either, couldn't you?
Yeah, what I'm not seeing from Bearman is, although he's made mistakes, and Scott's right, he should have many more points than he does have, and that's his own fault. And I don't feel like insurmountable problems. It doesn't feel like he's doing things that can't be easily fixed. And some of Ocon's points, I think like China it was slightly circumstantial in terms of the total amount he got from that score. So I think the gap is slightly inflated by circumstance, not much. But I also think that Bearman's problems are quite quick things for him to resolve. And yeah, I'm more on the Edd side. I would favour the pace, I think. I think as long as the pace is there and you feel like you've got the raw ingredients in rookie, the other stuff can be kind of moulded around it. And versus Antonelli, I just feel like he's not showing that pace, even though his yardstick, I think, is a harder yardstick than Bearman has.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm not talking down Bearman's speed, and I agree. Like if you're gonna, it's that classic. It's one of the oldest F1 cliches, isn't it, or motorsport cliches? It's easier to sort of calm down a fast driver than it is to make a sort of calm, reliable driver fast. So that's absolutely fine. On the China point, Bearman still inherited 8th in that race. Bearman got 4 points out of that. Ocon did get 10, but Ocon was the better driver on that one, so he should have had a bigger reward. It's just, I find it so fascinating because, and if anyone thinks I'm being unfair on Bearman, you twist it the other way. I'm doing him a favour because the 2 or 3 times I've talked him up this year, either in web form or audio form, he's then had a stinker at the following race. So maybe if I sort of sit here now and say he's been very quick, but he needs to do a better job. He hasn't done a good enough job on execution. Some of the races have been sloppy. I don't think he's scored points in the last 8 races, which is the worst of anyone who isn't Pierre Gasly's teammate at Alpine. Basically, maybe he'll then come out before the summer break and bank big, which I think would be it wouldn't be a massive surprise, to be honest, because that Haas looks quite handy. I mean, I think Silverstone is quite good for Haas and the traits of that car now, but the upgrade clearly worked. And if Bearman can replicate anything close to that form over the last 2 races before the summer break, he will have more points than he has as we sit here now and discuss it, because he was super fast at Silverstone. And you're right, he looked the class of the midfield there. It's just it was that one mistake which he massively regretted that denied him it, and then obviously a messy Grand Prix as well. But that was all a consequence of where he started.
But that's the other thing that gives me a lot of confidence in Bearman, is that he seems to be quicker to the Haas's potential, both the more difficult car at the start of the season and the better car that benefited from the Silverstone upgrade you mentioned. It feels like Ocon, even though he's got greater experience, is having to work a lot harder to get there. And we've heard a lot of talk from him about, my side of the garage and difficulties we're having with the car, etc. You don't hear any of that from Bearman. It's almost like, again, going back to the overthinking side of things that we talked about with Antonelli, Ocon's maybe doing that a bit. and it's allowing Bearman to get into his head, whereas Bearman is just kind of like, bang, I'm gonna get there. I'm gonna throw everything into getting to the limit of this car, however it sits in the midfield, and I think that's quite impressive.
Well, I think in summary, we need Antonelli to be a bit more Bearman and Bearman to be a bit more Antonelli in the second half of the season, so they fit together very nicely. Okay, let's now, Ben, move on to Isack Hadjar of Racing Bulls. 21 points he's got so far, 6 at Monaco is best. Has he defied the lower expectations of him coming into the season?
Yeah, I think so. He felt like, I think I've said this before, he felt like a driver that Red Bull didn't really have faith in, and he was almost promoted by accident as a ongoing consequence of the Perez situation. But he's had a really, really strong start. Good peaks. That Monaco top 6, I think that was super impressive. Probably the most outstanding moment. Although, being only a 10th off Tsunoda in Q1 in Melbourne was a pretty good start, and getting ahead of him in China as well. That surprised me. The one caveat with Hadjar is how good are the benchmarks? He's been up against Lawson, he's been up against Tsunoda. Would any of us have had Tsunoda in the top 10 of F1 drivers over any of the preceding seasons? Probably not. But that said, I don't think Tsunoda is as bad as he's being made to look in Red Bull now. So just trying to separate Hadjar from the drivers he's up against in the same team, I think he's benefited from, and he said it himself, the car being quite benign and user-friendly, but he's accessed it. He did Q3 4 times in a row from Imola to Canada. He's been in Q3 6 times out of the 12 races. In terms of delivering on the potential, we talked with Bearman about how he's kind of making silly mistakes and not quite getting the results he should do with the car at his disposal. I think Hadjar's been the opposite in that sense. I think he's, apart from the last couple, Austria and Silverstone, where he just seemed to go off boil a little bit, and Lawson seemed to assert himself a little bit more in phases. I think certainly the first 10 races, Hadjar's been doing pretty much the maximum you could have expected from him in that team.
He's interesting, Hadjar, isn't he, Scott? Because he sort of sits a bit more between Antonelli and Bearman in terms of the overall approach, in that there haven't been so many occasions where you've kind of had your jaw dropping at his speed, but it's been quite consistent. Oh, that's quick, and he's been delivering in races. And how you untangle that from the overall car performance, etc., is really interesting. What I do think was good is, given there were question marks about how kind of mentally strong he could be, and that was one of the doubts that Red Bull had, for him to have what happened in Australia and then come back and do what he's done, I think was a really good test and a very, very good show of what he can do. I think that shows that some of those concerns were misplaced. He's got that resilience. That Japan weekend where he was the Class B winner, if you like, was an outstanding one. And that's, I guess, the question with Hadjar. Just where do you think his peaks lie compared to the others? That's probably the key question with him.
I think the first thing to say is that the most recent results, the most recent weekends actually haven't been as bad as they looked. Canada was a consequence of that he had a small grid penalty for impeding Carlos Sainz, but he had qualified in the top 10 there, as Ben mentioned. He was one of the early victims of graining in that race, but then it was just kind of sort of peak Toro Rosso era strategy from Racing Bulls, which then just left him on a hiding to nothing at the back of the DRS train. So that race was done. I think he picked up damage on the first lap in Austria, which was costing him massive amounts of performance and lap time. So his race was ruined on lap 1 there. He did have a small deficit to Lawson that weekend. He was not the fastest. That was the only weekend this season, I would say, that he's not been the fastest Racing Bulls driver. He didn't get
damage on lap 1, I don't think. He got damage later, wasn't it? I think he got damage at turn 1, but in the final stint of the race. I think Hadjar's, yeah, because I was following that weekend quite closely, and his argument was that he could have been in the top 10, top 8 without that damage, and you had to kind of extrapolate his race plot and how much it tailed off in the last part.
Oh, no, you're right. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. I mixed up turn 1 and lap 1 in my notes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. No. So because I think he was doing a good job. I think he did a good job in Austria. He had, I think Q2 went slightly awry for him just because he suddenly picked up some entry understeer at high speed, which just basically robbed him of some sort of confidence and attacking the start of the laps in Q2. But he'd made a good step from practice to qualifying. I don't think he was going to get a Lawson-like result in Austria, even if qualifying had gone slightly differently. As I say, he was second best there. But that's another race that could have ended in points very easily for him. And then obviously Silverstone, yes, obviously what happened with him rear-ending Antonelli, a poor error, but one that you kind of understand when you see the onboard footage, such that it was as he drives into the wall of spray. And more importantly, he was immediately back to having that sort of 1/2 advantage over Lawson that weekend. So I think he has still kind of, I think he's still been sort of roughly about where he was when he was really catching the eye with good results. But there's a bit of that car's not been updated as much as others in the midfield. So I think the car's slipped back a little bit. Lawson, not taking anything away from him, did a fantastic job to get that result in Austria. But other than that, it's been a bit hard going the last 2 or 3. And then if I go back to the start of the season, just to avoid a bit of recency bias, the thing that impresses me most there, or 2 things. One is just to have that pace from the get-go, from basically the first qualifying sims in Melbourne. He's pretty much on it. And don't forget, he came into the season with the least F1 experience of anybody. Even Gabriel Bortoleto, I think, had slightly more than Hadjar had. And to Edd's point about the we'll call it the mental side, that's a very broad brushstroke. I don't think it actually proves the concerns were misplaced. I think the concerns were valid. I think what he's done is proven that he can take it on board and deal with it, because I think the people around him have been very impressed. And someone quite senior at Red Bull, not Racing Bulls, Red Bull, told me a few races into this season, he thinks in hindsight what happened in Melbourne on that formation lap's the best thing that could have happened to Hadjar, because it helped humble him early. Not that he was getting super arrogant or anything like that, but you know what it's like for a rookie. If you come in, you're nailing it straight away, everything's going right. And if you do have a little bit of a tendency to potentially not have the best resilience that you need to have, something like that happening really early on. It's a massive, massive test. He could have crumbled instantly in that moment. He didn't. He bounced back amazingly. And he's done that a few times since then. Japan, obviously, he was in massive physical discomfort with the positioning of the belts in Q1, and he was really spiralling. You could hear it over the radio as he was basically apologising to the team, thinking he was screwing it up. But he went out, did the lap, got into Q2, belts were sorted for the rest of the session, nailed it. That set up the performance that Edd mentioned earlier. And even in Monaco, hit the wall twice in FP2. That's enough to derail any driver. A crash into the wall in Monaco during practice. But he didn't. He went on and had his best result of the season that weekend. So I've been super impressed by Hadjar. There are clearly some bits like any even the best performing rookies where you're like, okay, that needs to be tidied up. This needs to be a bit more consistent. And there are a couple of valid question marks. How good is that car really? How much of a step would there be if there was a more experienced guy in there? What would a Bearman or an Antonelli be doing in that car? You can ask those questions pretty much, as much as you want. But I think you can only really judge Hadjar on what we've got in front of us. And I think the body of work's been really good for the first 12 races.
Yeah, he's probably got the most rookie-friendly car, but at the same time, the key thing is judging how much they extract out of what they've got. And Hadjar's been pretty impressive when it comes to that. Shall we move on now to Franco Colapinto, Scott? As we discussed, could be stretching the definition of a rookie somewhat. He had those 9 starts for Williams last year, but he's also had the disadvantage of coming in at Alpine with a quarter of the season done and dusted. So that probably balances it up. I imagine people listening will think, well, Colapinto's been a disaster, but there is a little bit more to it than that.
Yes, there is. Because and when I say the team here, I don't necessarily mean the people at Enstone or the people working trackside, but Alpine as a whole is a bit of a disaster at the moment. It's we've gone from having no crisis team in F1 this year because no team's like adrift at the back or anything like that. But Alpine's the closest thing to it. It's certainly the most troubled team in F1, and it's a horrible situation for. It was a horrible. We'll get into Jack Doohan in a bit, but it's a horrible situation for both the rookies that Alpine's fielded this year. And I think the circumstances around a Colapinto situation, I know we joked about it at the start of the podcast, but that is, for me, exactly why it's valid to consider him a rookie. He did a healthy number of races last year, did nine Grand Prix, but he went into that off the back of an FP1 outing at Silverstone and the Abu Dhabi test the previous year. That's the sum total of his F1 experience before he became a Grand Prix driver, which is pretty minimal. And then he switched teams over the winter, obviously, and he's done, I think 2 or 3 TPC tests, or maybe 3 or 4 TPC runs before he got the race seat anyway. Missed obviously pre-season testing in the 2025 car, so he's doing his TPC work in a 2023 Alpine on those Pirelli tyres, which aren't relevant, and all of that. Then he's got into the real thing, and I think he's been very surprised by how different it is to the Williams. As I understand it, the 25 Alpine's very stiff and handles and responds very differently to the Williams of last year, which was still a tricky car to drive, but was at least more compliant. You could feel it a little bit more. You could kind of force it and take it to the limit more because you could feel the feedback you got from that car was better. This car feels like a lower level kind of hybrid of a Ferrari McLaren kind of situation where the feeling through the front axle is not great and the rear is very stiff, so it's sensitive to certain areas and it's a difficult car to master. Pierre Gasly's doing a fantastic job with it when he's at his best. He still has a couple of Pierre Gasly weekends where you're like, where's he disappeared to? But generally speaking, like, and I've written a piece about this on the website, and I think we discussed this briefly on a previous podcast. Like, Gasly's basically like in a Max Verstappen style situation, but just an Alpine level version of it, where you've got a lead driver who's in tune with what the car does and is just working with it, and basically less experienced, slightly lesser drivers are coming unstuck. And all of that is just a situation that I think has just not brought the best out of Colapinto versus last year when he proved he can score points in the F1 midfield. And to top it all off, he basically got given that seat being told by Briatore, right, you need to score points now. At the point he'd got that seat, I think Gasly had scored points in a single Grand Prix. He'd scored points. He got a point in the Miami Sprint as well. But in terms of actual Grand Prix, I think he scored once in the first 6. And that's Gasly. He's a race winner and a podium finisher. Got other podium finishes in F1. But you're telling your rookie driver who's never driven the car before that he has to start scoring points as well. Like, it's a borderline impossible situation. So I have a huge amount of sympathy for Colapinto.
Yeah, and I think although he hasn't got any points, he's had signs of promise. Canada was probably the best all-round weekend, I think you'd have to say. There have been a few trip-ups. But he's an interesting one, isn't he, Ben? Because Colapinto's racing with this sort of Damocles hanging over him right from the start. He can't guarantee that he'll be still in the car after the next double-header. There even end up being rumours that he could be out for the upcoming double-header. I don't think he will be. That would be madness. But while I'll always say it's down to drivers who are in the car to do what they can do to make themselves undroppable, the amount of nonsense going on at Alpine makes it very, very difficult to do that, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's almost impossible situation to judge fairly. I mean, you mentioned it would be mad to drop him before the next doubleheader, but I wouldn't put it past Alpine. And if you judge it by their own criteria and the way they treated Doohan before Colapinto, he should be out because he had an okay weekend in Canada. But other than that, I don't think he's shown anything like the best of himself. And it doesn't look anything like the driver he did in that Williams cameo. And I appreciate the cars will be different. You know, everyone switching teams will have that kind of moment of, oh, the DNA of this car, if you like, is different, or it has certain traits that don't necessarily gel with you. But as we always say, you know, a big part of the job of the driver is to adapt. As we class him a rookie, he should have fewer bad habits or, you know, ingrained habits, let's say, that make that process more difficult. I don't think the last year's Williams was blessed with great total downforce, just like the current Alpine isn't. I think they have to trim it out quite a bit, don't they, because of the engine deficit they have and the hybrid deficit they have. So I don't think the difficulty of the car can completely explain it. If the car was absolutely dog awful, then Gasly I don't think would be as outstanding as he has been, unless, you know, Pierre Gasly has become, you know, the best driver on the grid suddenly over the winter or over the second half of last year. I'll caveat it by saying, well, maybe Alpine's been hit more by the clamp down on flexible wings. It seemed like they were at the outer end of that spectrum. It didn't seem to have the massive impact everyone was expecting, but we know early in the season they had to change the wing. So I wonder if, you know, the car is been thrown out of its ideal window a bit more, and Colapinto's been unlucky to get into it at the time it's at its worst, if you like. But I mean, that's about it. You know, he's got into that team with the aim of pushing out Doohan to get the drive, has done that, and then just hasn't delivered. So, you know, he shouldn't really be in the car based on what Alpine are doing. But I think, you know, as long as the sponsorship money keeps coming through, he'll keep the seat. Whether that's a fair situation or not is a completely different question. But yeah, certainly I've been disappointed because based on what he did at Williams, how he threw himself in, how much he impressed the team, how he drove with kind of freedom. I know there were mistakes and a few costly crashes, but again, they didn't seem to affect him. This feels like the opposite. It feels like he did his first weekend at Imola, crashed when at a really unfortunate time in qualifying, and just hasn't recovered. And I said at the start of the podcast, I'm still waiting for the real Antonelli to show up, and I feel like I'm also waiting for the real Colapinto to show up.
I think one thing Colapinto needs to improve, and you expect this to an extent for a rookie. I'm doing an interview with him in Abu Dhabi last year, and he said that the one crash that really annoyed him was the Vegas crash, when he was basically under strict instructions not to crash because the parts bin was pretty much empty.
Yeah.
And he had a little bit of a wide moment in a right-hander, and then he kind of tried to take the left-hander immediately after him, basically right-left in the same way, even though he was wider. So he hit the wall, and he said that was a failure of risk evaluation, and he was right. And I'm still seeing signs of that this year. The Silverstone crash, that was on his second push lap on his first Q1 run on a lap that wasn't really going anywhere. That crash did not need to happen. And so that's what I want to see him working his way out of. But of course, if you're racing for your career every time you go out, that makes it more difficult. We'll get into a little bit more.
That might be the key difference, Ed, because speaking to people at Williams last year, they felt that he drove with nothing to lose. It's like he saw the 9-race cameo as, well, this is it. I might only ever do 9 Grand Prix, so I'm just going to give everything I can and not worry about it. It didn't feel to him, and certainly to Williams, like he was driving for his future. Whereas you're absolutely right. This time, it's completely different. It's the sword of Damocles, isn't it? It's like every race counts, and it just seems to be like crushing him almost.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get a little bit more into Colapinto when we talk about Doohan, because there's a logical comparison there in the final part. But yeah, it's been a tough time for him so far. Probably the rookie most desperately in need of a result. Okay, let's get on to part 3 of the podcast now. Normally I'd throw the next driver, Gabriel Bortoleto, at one of you two, but I'm going to tackle him first simply because
he's a Sauber driver.
Well, of course, I'm always into the Sauber drivers, but I have been doing some quite in-depth analysis of him lately. I did an interview with him at Silverstone for a story on the race website, which by the time you hear this should be published. So, Ed, Bortoleto, probably been the lowest profile of the rookies. So how is he really doing? Well, excellent question there. I'd say he's doing a lot better than I think a lot will realise. People will look at the fact Hülkenberg's been getting those big results, the 37-4 point split, which does not flatter Bortoleto at all. But I think you're always looking for performance with rookies, and their qualifying head-to-head is basically, to all intents and purposes, identical. It's 7-7 across the 14 sessions, and there's about a 400th advantage in Hülkenberg's favour. So it's near as makes no difference. They're performing at the same level in qualifying. And even Silverstone, for example, where Bortoleto had made an error and spun in FP3 and he was on the older spec floor, as a consequence, he managed to outqualify Hülkenberg there. So qualifying performance has been really good. The race performances have been more up and down, but he has also been on the wrong side of things often. Down the grid, you quite often see split strategies. And I think Spain was probably the great illustration of this, because Hülkenberg, actually Bortoleto out-qualified him. They were running together in the first stint, but basically Bortoleto went twice the length in the first stint. They were on the same soft tyres, and that meant he was not in the points come the end of the race. And Hülkenberg was in the position to take that great 5th place. But Bortoleto absolutely should have been there in the points with him. So we've seen, I think, some decent race performances from him. He's definitely got more confident as the car has improved in terms of being less peaky, better through corner balance, but he's been pretty quick from the start. So I would say Bortoleto has actually been very, very unobtrusively and quietly impressive in difficult circumstances, even though his only real highlight that I think people will have noticed will have been the Austrian Grand Prix weekend where he made Q3, finished 8th. But even there, he could have finished a little bit higher if he'd got past Alonso, and he admits that. So I don't know what you make of Bortoleto, Scott. Obviously, I've been sort of particularly interested in him the past few days going through his season, but has he caught your attention?
Yeah, massively. In fact, there's sort of 2 different versions of it from the first phase of the season that really interests me. Straight away in testing, and then in Australia, when I was in his media session there, I came away thinking one of the best sort of rookie impressions that I can remember, in terms of just the way that a driver kind of presents themselves. Not in a like, he's saying all the right things, but just in a like, there was sort of a mix of like confidence, openness, about him that just I think he's quite a naturally charismatic person. So he leaves a good impression on you just in general when you speak to him. But the way he was picking up on certain things about like car behavior from testing and the sort of attitude that he had for the rookie season, there was a sharpness there that was it comes across very clearly when you speak to him. So that encouraged me. And then I remember in Saudi just thinking, because it was another qualifying session where obviously like the Sauber form early in the year wasn't good. It was a Q1 car that was capable of sneaking into Q2 if they absolutely nailed it, and others slightly underachieved. But even by that point, it was clear that Bortoleto's one-lap pace was actually looking really good compared to Hülkenberg. And I did actually say that to him in the mix zone after qualifying. I said, I know that the results aren't great, but you seem to be doing really well against Nico in qualifying. And he seemed genuinely pleased at that point that someone had noticed, because obviously you know at that point where he's come off the back of 2 titles in junior categories, and then suddenly you're 16th, 17th, 18th or worse in qualifying, and then it can snowball very quickly in terms of people writing you off and just thinking you're a no-hoper and you're going to be like a 1 or 2 season wonder in F1. I don't get that from Bortoleto at all. And I think the fact that the one-lap pace has been so impressive, it's actually kind of funny because his F3 and F2 seasons that were so impressive were kind of built on the opposite, where like his pace was fine. He wasn't a slow driver at all. But I felt like he won those titles because he was the best all-round driver. And pieced together just really, really strong seasons, really like level-headed, good execution, played some sort of, rolled the dice a couple of times on strategy, but had to kind of execute them at the same time, and it worked. And that was what was impressive. And the question was like, but how fast is he? But he's coming to F1, and actually like the speed for me is not a question. Like the guy's clearly very quick, but how much of the missed opportunities on Sundays are purely down to circumstances, as you've explained, Ed. Things like the Spain Sunday, like can't really do anything about that. But I think it was in Canada, which would have been one race later, where I think Bortoleto said one thing he was learning very quickly alongside Hülkenberg was he needs to do a better job of maximising the opportunities when certain things shift during a Grand Prix. He needs to put himself in better positions, and he needs to kind of build his experience bank a bit more quickly to then be able to react to certain scenarios a little bit more sharply. So I think there is a little bit more that he can do as well on Sundays, to just kind of turn that obvious promise into something that sort of bears something even remotely resembling Hülkenberg's haul so far this season. Because you're right, that is a very unfair comparison. If we say that Ocon versus Bearman's not quite reflective of the pace and performance of the 2 drivers, I think Sauber is much more extreme than that.
Yeah, he is interesting insofar as he's very, very good in terms of understanding what he needs to do, because he says, right, the key is adaptability. I've got to be able to adapt to a wide range of car characteristics. That's absolutely critical. There's none of that, if the car's just made the way I like it, I'll be quick, which you sometimes see from drivers, and that is very limiting. So I think that's very positive. If you compare to Hülkenberg, he's still a little bit more leans towards that slightly later braking approach in the sort of slower corners, sort of carrying the speed in. Hülkenberg tends to brake a little bit earlier. That's something that Bortoleto is working on. He kind of admits that there are times when he knows he needs to kind of take a slightly different braking approach, but sort of when you're on a qualifying lap, you can default to kind of really attacking, and that's the weird thing about these cars. He's really impressive in the fast corners, probably stronger than Hülkenberg in terms of the speed he can carry through them. He actually has a touch of the Piastris in terms of the first season, the kind of driver he is stylistically, which is interesting as well. So that there's those positives, but there have been mistakes as well. Australia, he crashed out, the stupid moment in battling with Antonelli in Monaco, binning it admittedly on slicks in the damp at Silverstone. So there have been errors. Also, what have you made of him, Ben? Obviously, you got to follow closely in Austria when you were doing the driver rankings when he had his high point weekend.
Yeah, I was very impressed with how quick he was that weekend. It was one of those where everything just seemed to click from like the first lap of practice, and he impressively carried that through. He didn't get lost. I don't think he had to work on the car too much, so that probably helped simplify things. It was a case of just running with it, and he was very, very impressive in Q2. And then I came away slightly underwhelmed, not massively, but he just didn't quite deliver in Q3. And then the race, I felt there was just a little bit left on the table. You mentioned the Alonso battle. He got schooled there by Alonso. And I mean, that's no bad thing because obviously Alonso is one of the most wily racers out there. But he should have been able to overtake Alonso and didn't. And actually, Hülkenberg's race from the back was more impressive than Bortoleto's. And so I just felt like it wasn't the complete weekend. I felt, he'd been so under the radar, and then finally he's not under the radar. Everyone's noticing, and he just didn't quite deliver the absolute most he could have versus Liam Lawson, who desperately needed a good weekend and did. And I just thought, it's not quite there. I feel like, you've talked me round because his season has been very much under the radar, and I didn't realise he was so close, in the qualifying comparison with Hülkenberg. That's very good, and a great baseline. So I guess the verdict would be sort of quietly effective. It feels like he's a good all-rounder, but maybe still needs to piece a few more bits together. It's quite similar to Hadjar, I think, just without maybe so many highlights or so many obvious highlights. So maybe that's just more a function of how disjointed the Sauber season has been. And then just as the car has really started to come good, it's Hülkenberg, not purely through circumstance, but certainly, in some cases through circumstance, who's been the one getting the results. And that's just kind of, again, kept Bortoleto, unfortunately, in the shadows.
I'm glad that you mentioned Austria and sort of the way that race played out, because I was very pleased for him to get that result, but I did feel immediately in the moment there was a better one on the table there, and I think there were two things that went against him. One was the fact that it was Alonso he was up against, because it was that worst case scenario combination of the most wily and experienced racer on the grid, and it's his manager as well, effectively. So I just don't think Bortoleto was ever going to do everything he could to get past him. He was not the person to risk something against. But I also think it was the magnitude of the situation. A couple of near misses recently. There was a really clear opportunity there to bank points. Do you just make sure that do you have a go to get seventh, but just don't do anything that would just jeopardise eighth? And in that way, and I don't think they're identical drivers at all, but it reminded me a lot of when Mick Schumacher got that result at Silverstone a couple of years ago. And you're like, it finally came together. It didn't come out in exactly the same circumstances, but it finally came together. He's running in the points. This is a result Mick really, really needs. But do you remember he was chasing Max Verstappen in the damaged Red Bull late on? And You're like, you should have beaten him. Like, you got bullied off the track. You got maxed, basically, a couple of times. And you didn't you've done well. It's a good result. Like, I'm glad you've got it. But there was more there. And if you'd executed that properly. But what that didn't do, obviously, was be a springboard for Schumacher to go on in the second half of the season. For someone like Bortoleto, I would hope that what he experienced in Austria in the race there was massively, massively educational. So I would expect him to do better if he got in that situation again.
Well, he wasn't the only driver in that race in Austria to kind of get a bit schooled on tyre management by a more experienced teammate. I mentioned Ollie Bearman, his middle stint versus Ocon. That was key to him being the weaker Haas driver in that race. And it's actually quite similar with the Sauber drivers. Not something I expected from Hülkenberg either, who earlier in his career was not famed for being particularly strong on tyre management, but actually he bested Bortoleto with a much stronger middle part of the race. And although I forgive rookies much more in that circumstance because it's so idiosyncratic and strange with the Pirelli tyres, that's the bit where you're like, okay, there's still an obvious gap here, as well as the obvious bits of underperformance in terms of the last bit of qualifying and the Alonso battle. There was a core part of the race where Bortoleto had the advantage of good track position and the favourable strategy call, if you like, but just didn't quite deliver what he could. And it's a shame because you'd like to see someone when everything's falling away and everything's working for you in terms of the car balance, etc., and how you fit with the track. You want to come away feeling that you've done everything you can, and he just hasn't quite had one of those races, I don't think. Certainly not one I've noticed. Maybe Edd, in his deep dive, has found a race that nobody remembers where Bortoleto absolutely maximised everything on his weekend.
Yeah, Spain was probably the closest one to that. But yeah, I'd certainly agree with that. I think the really encouraging thing about that Austria result is, or Bortoleto's reaction to Austria, is when he spoke with the media on Thursday at Silverstone, which is both where he did a proper open media session and I had a one-to-one with him. He was very, very frank about Austria. He said, yeah, I should have beaten Alonso. and then he could have gone after Lawson as well. I know I didn't. He outthought me with the DRS line. And that's the thing that I just really like, because it's so easy for rookies to just say, oh, if this happened, it'd have been great, I'm a hero.
Well, like Hadjar did in Austria.
Well, yeah. And but the thing is, the drivers that consistently do that are the rookies that plateau, because it's always external things. But the thing I really like with Bortoleto is it's always, I've done that, but I could have done this better. He keeps saying, I want to be the most complete driver I can possibly be. I want to be as adaptable. I look at what Nico does, and he's got such clarity about what he's trying to achieve with the tyres, what he's trying to achieve out of every run in practice. And that's what I want to get to. And he even said that he's sometimes frustrated by the fact that he's not yet as good as he wants to be, in terms of he knows he needs to build up that data bank. And those sorts of things tally with what we're hearing from the team in terms of his approach as well. So it's not just lip service. He's not just saying it. That's the driver he's living. And that's what really I like about Bortoleto.
Because is he overthinking it though, Ed? Is he overthinking it?
I mean, you could argue he is, but I don't think when he's talking about that stuff, he's being asked about it specifically. He's not coming into the room and holding court on it. So
I think Piastri comparison that you made earlier is a really good one. It reminds me, but a lot of Oscar in the way that he goes about things, the sort of little question marks that did exist from his junior successes coming into F1, and then a bit hard to kind of judge exactly how he's doing. But it is that kind of same, slightly different personalities, but there's a similarity in the way that they go about things and the feedback you're hearing from two very, very different teams in Sauber and McLaren. But that's the thing, because it's a fine line between having the right approach and work ethic and what Ben's saying about overthinking. And the worst thing you can be as a rookie is be apathetic to the idea of working hard and think you've got it, but you can go too far the other way. But I do think Bortoleto is more in that kind of I hadn't thought about him in the context of that first Piastri season in McLaren, but what you've been saying there from your one-to-one with Bortoleto, Ed, is when I spoke to Piastri in the summer of 23 and spoke to his race engineer as well for a piece that we did, it's chiming a lot. There's a lot of crossover there, and you remember with Piastri, one of the big question marks: how quick's this guy? And then once he got into F1, it was, speed's fine, but actually can he piece it together? Because he's going missing in too many races and he's getting demolished by his more experienced teammate on certain tracks. So it is interesting. I think there is still, in my mind, a bit of a question mark over how good Bortoleto can be, but I think he's got a lot of the different raw ingredients that you need. I don't see anything obvious missing. It's just whether or not all those sort of constituent parts are at a high enough level.
Exactly, and we're going to see that over time. But yeah, there is a similarity with Piastri in that Bortoleto, he's 20, but he's 20 going on 35, and I mean that as a positive. But he does have the feel, and Piastri had that same feel. Whereas, and again, everybody's different, and it's not there's a right or a wrong way to do it, but that's just the impression you get. Whereas when you speak to someone like Hadjar, you get the impression this is a young guy, not because he's out of control or anything, but just it's just very, very, it's just little differences in terms of how people are and how people approach things. And there's different advantages and disadvantages. But that's the thing that strikes you with Bortoleto. If you had just sat down in front of him and said, right, how long has this guy been around in F1? You'd be like, oh, has he been here 15 years or is this his first season? Don't really know. And same with Piastri, who's just so kind of sort of under control.
I felt similar about Norris and Russell, actually, when they were rookies. I remember interviewing them just before their first races, and Russell did feel, it came across like a guy who was more mature and sort of more ready, if you like. And it felt like Norris took a while to catch up, but you look at them now and say, well, give or take, they're performing at a similar level, having great success. So it does show that the picture you get initially isn't necessarily the one that defines the driver going on. There's more than one way to make it work.
Exactly. But it is always interesting to draw those comparisons, and it's all about. This is just a snapshot of all these drivers. Scott, should we just finish off by reaching deep into our memories and talking about Jack Doohan? He was benched by Alpine after 6 races. So how was his brief stint? Yeah,
so actually for Doohan, I was weighing up how to answer this, and I figured I'd actually decide by what the runtime of the podcast would be. And as we've just ticked over past the hour mark, given the extensive dive. You can tell that you've just interviewed Bortoleto, but I think it's very interesting. Certainly,
it's all right. Once we've edited out the nonsense, it'll be down to 6 or 7 minutes. What we've done.
No, I had a suggestion for Doohan, because what I would say is actually like this might be covering Doohan might be a way of sort of segueing into the ranking, basically, because I personally don't think you can separate Doohan and Colapinto almost at all. I think there's different. There was definitely moments of what Doohan did that were more impressive than Colapinto. I think there were more often little flashes, and he was unlucky, Bahrain, for example, not to break his point stuck there and score in the same race that Gasly did. But actually, thematically, their parts of the season so far are almost identical. They've gone in with a really, really difficult job to do, and almost being undermined from the start by the person really in charge of the team. They're in a difficult car to drive with a benchmarking Gasly who is making them look silly at times when he absolutely nails it. I think Colapinto falls more foul of that than Doohan has, because I think Doohan got closer to Gasly than people perhaps realised. But then you look at it, it's basically too many mistakes and still not scoring points. So they're very similar in that regard. And in a way, you can argue with Doohan, it's more frustrating because you're like, oh, why was this not being pieced together? But it was such a short sample set. You should be allowed to make those mistakes. The first lap crash in Australia, the practice crash in Japan, the first lap accident in Miami, where he'd out-qualified Gasly and was looking like it wasn't necessarily going to be a points finish, but that looked like a weekend and a race in which he was genuinely just going to be better than Gasly throughout, and that would have made it dropping him, like Alpine would have looked very silly for dropping him had that been converted. So I think my summary for Doohan is basically that I think he was better than a lot of people probably gave him credit for, and probably better than he'll get remembered if people do actually consider him, because he's just basically the forgotten man of 2025 now. And I think his 6-race stint was better than Colapinto's. I wouldn't argue that Colapinto has been better or even as impressive as Doohan was. But I just think the situations are such they are they're basically utterly inseparable in terms of trying to judge them when you look at the bigger picture.
Well, shall we, as you said, we're going to rank in the last part, so we can kind of, in talking about Doohan, start off with working out ranks. I think we're probably all going to have the 2 Alpine rookies as 5th and 6th, aren't we? Let's try and divide. See what you think of this, Ben. I would contend it probably has to be just Doohan 5th and Colapinto 6th, for the simple reason that Doohan had the pace to give Gasly the hurry up on occasions, which Colapinto hasn't really done, with the caveat that obviously Doohan had the better run into the season, incumbency done the last race last year. And that's why I don't like people being put even. I think you've got to commit to something. So I'd say Doohan just shades Colapinto for 5th. How would you say?
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd maybe not so much shades. I feel like in hindsight, Doohan isn't a driver they should have dropped on pure performance terms. He was on a decent trajectory, as you say. Even though the results weren't there, he had some raw pace to give Gasly something to think about. I don't feel like Colapinto's shown any of that, and also has spent a lot of practice sessions looking like he's miles off the bottom, which I don't feel like Doohan ever did. So I think in performance terms, I'd have Colapinto a clear 6th and Doohan 5th. I think the circumstances, Scott's right, quite similar in terms of both of them being under unnecessary pressure from the start. I accept Colapinto hasn't had the same run-up, but he also has the benefit of 9 prior F1 starts. So I think when you balance it all out, Colapinto's a clear 6th for me and Doohan 5th.
Yeah, I think they have to be next to each other. I agree with you, Ed. One of the notes that I made was that I'd never normally advocate for 2 drivers sharing the place in the ranking, because I always think it's a cop-out. I felt circumstantially like you could maybe make a case for it in that they're inseparable insofar as neither's done a good job, but how can they in the situation they've been put in? But if you do judge them on an individual basis, Doohan's ahead of Colapinto, so I'm fine with that.
Absolutely. Well, we've got them 5th and 6th, and obviously they're in the nonsense world of Alpine, which puts a big asterisk against both of them.
Alpine is 7th. Alpine is definitely 7th.
Yeah, exactly. Now, sorting out the top 4, I think, is going to be quite challenging. So, do you want to open up, Ben? Do you want to have a punt for someone for one of those? Should we try and decide who's number 1?
Well, I had initially, I thought Bortoleto was number 4, but your argument was quite convincing about how maybe he's been like the stealth hit of the rookies. So now I'm feeling like probably Antonelli is 4th.
Yeah, interesting. If we try and do you want to try and commit to a 4th? What do you reckon, Scott?
Yeah, I think working our way up to first makes the most sense. And I'll be honest, I've when I was doing a rough order before we started this, because I thought I want to leave myself open to any particular argument swaying me, like clearly Edd's opus on Bortoleto has, which I think is absolutely right. And just perfectly timed interview coming into this podcast. It's certainly the most the Race F1 podcast airtime that Bortoleto is going to have this season, but I do think rightly so.
Until he wins the Brazilian Grand Prix.
Yes, that's true. I think I have to have Antonelli 4th, and I would just caveat that very slightly by saying that I think it is I think that 4 is a good crop. I think it's a really good crop of rookies. And
it's a strong 4th, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think if we just saw a bit more of that, like Miami qualifying, Canada Sunday kind of replicated over the second half of the season, he'd vault up quite quickly. But just on the evidence of what we've seen now, I have just been very slightly underwhelmed. I expected a bit more from him.
Yeah, I think we're probably all happy with Antonelli 4th, but I would say he's running 4th at the moment, but he absolutely could be ranked 1 by us come the end of the season. So he's still very much in the race. So a top 3 now. Should we move up to 3rd? I've got a 3rd place in mind I'd probably go with Bearman. Very, very fast, but I'm genuinely irritated by his failure to convert that, not only into race results often enough, but also he doesn't convert it into qualifying performances often enough. And even when he does, like Silverstone, where he qualified well, he finds his way down to the back of the grid almost because of a penalty. And it's just like, it frustrates me to see a driver who is being that quick, just finding so many ways not to deliver on it. So he's been impressive. So what do you say to Bearman 3rd, Ben?
Yeah, I forgive him. And I would say that he's in my top 2, and I would have Bortoleto 3rd. I think your argument for Bortoleto has raised him in my estimation, but I still feel like that's like a stealth, solid, assured start to the rookie season. More assured than Antonelli. I think Antonelli psyched himself out. So I'd put Bortoleto 3rd, and I'd have Bearman because of the pace, just the pure pace and the fact that he's showing it. That elevates him for me. Okay,
Scott. So I'd have Bortoleto 2nd and Bearman 3rd. Ben would have it the other way round. You are the casting vote, unless you want to get Hadjar involved in this.
Okay, this is tricky. It is very tricky. What I would say that I think is the slight difference maker for Bearman is, I think, something actually inadvertently you did recently, Ed, that made me realise it more than I had, which is when we did our sort of Untangling the Midfield Teams podcast, which is the podcast that we had previously recorded before this one, and you thought we'd recorded this one when we started recording this earlier.
I lose track. So many podcasts.
Which is when you put together that Class B Championship table, which alerted me to actually just how close Bearman's come in the last sort of few races, really. He's been just on the fringes of points at a time where Haas has been treading water, basically, in the midfield. And I hadn't realised that he was like quite so close to points. I think in those moments and in those weekends, you go, Bearman's 11th, Bearman's 12th, he's done a good job. But then when you sort of like reflect on the last sort of half dozen races as a whole, you don't necessarily put them together and notice the trend. And it was really only seeing it in sort of that Class B Championship form, where, you know, like it's him and Bortoleto are the worst of the full-time drivers so far this season in terms of points. But when you look at it from a Class B perspective, so basically when you do this, you eliminate the big 4 teams and then you do finishing positions and then points as a result, based on how the midfielders would have finished in that. And Bearman actually jumps, you know, Stroll and Lawson in a Class B Championship table, he's behind them by quite a bit in the in the main ones, and you know he's not a million miles off the likes of Sainz, Alonso, and Gasly, and he certainly he compares a lot better to Ocon in that table than he does in the real one. And I know that's, you know, you could argue that that's convenient and that's, you know, using some data to prove a point, but I think it's important because what that Haas is a marginal point scoring car in the midfield. And Ocon's done a really good job to bank bigger points when he can. And Bearman's not done a good enough job to actually score the real world points. But he's actually come a lot closer than people think on the weekends where hasn't been as strong. And I think that does count for something. So that, plus the fact that I think he's been out and out really fast, I think I have to put him just slightly ahead of Bortoleto.
Yes. Okay, so we've got Bearman second and Bortoleto third, which means Isack Hadjar's P1, which I guess, Ben, would have been a little bit of a surprise if we'd said that in January, but at the same time, he's always had a good amount of quality under him. I felt this could be one of those seasons that could go either way, but I've been impressed right back to that FP1 debut he made in Mexico. I remember writing a piece for the website, so I was quite impressed by his evolution through that session. But yeah, he's a pretty convincing number one, even though, again, I would say any of those top four could come through to be the star rookie by the end of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's just made the most assured start, been the most consistent, like you said earlier. He's been 5 times in the points, which is as many times as Ocon and Hulkenberg, who've been probably the most effective in terms of converting chances, let's say, in the first half of the season. Plus that run of Q3s, like he's the one who's put it together the most in the first part of this season. And in terms of beating expectation, in terms of beating mine as well, I mean, I had almost 0. Like I say, I felt like he was almost accidentally in F1, but he's kind of taken it by storm in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I presume, Scott, you've got no reservations about Isack Hadjar P1 at this stage?
No, him being first in this ranking was the clearest note that I made when I sort of formed one before the podcast. I didn't really have any doubt, to be honest. I think he's been really, really fast. He's coped with difficult situations well. He's put together clean weekends when he's needed to. He's performing. He's bang in the middle in the real championship. He's in 11th there. I think he's second in our sort of fictional Class B championship as well. So again, in relative terms, in that midfield fight, he's actually doing even better than he is in the overall sort of scheme of things. So been really impressed so far. And like I said when we were talking about him earlier, I think he's been slightly better than the most recent results make him look as well. So even if you were slightly swayed by a bit of recency bias or just going, but has he wobbled? Like, I don't really think he has. I think he has, he can do a better job, certainly, but I think he's been really impressive so far.
So to go through our final ranking from 1 to 6, P1, Isack Hadjar, 2, Ollie Bearman, 3, Gabriel Bortoleto, 4, Kimi Antonelli, 5, Jack Doohan, 6, Franco Colapinto, but still with all to play for in the second half of the year in terms of who's going to be the star rookie. I'm sure we'll discuss this again come the end of the season, and let's see how they build from this point. But hopefully we've been able to give you a little bit of insight into those rookie performers. So thanks very much, Scott and Ben, for joining the debate. We're now looking towards Spa, which is rapidly approaching, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.